Hello, everyone. Welcome to Fired Up, the podcast for marketers working in early and late stage startups. I'm Morgan McClintock, the CEO of startup marketing agency Firebrand. We've launched this podcast to interview the best in the business, but I'm not going to do it alone. So please meet my co-hosts.
I'm Nicole Pytel, Firebrand's VP of Content Marketing.
And I'm Chris Ulbrich, Firebrand's Head of Media Relations.
I'm Ian Lipner, a tech PR and crisis communications veteran.
We'll drop a new episode each week, so there's plenty of fuel for your marketing fire. Get the spark you need to take your startup to a whole new level. Hello and welcome to Fired Up, the startup marketing podcast. My name's Morgan McClintock and I'm joined today by my co-host, Nicole Pytel. Nicole, hi, how are you?
Hi there, Morgan. Doing well, thanks. Ironically, I just got off a client call where we were talking about trying to figure out what buyers are doing, what website visitors are doing, because they just don't know. And it was the perfect segue for our guest today, because it's something that a lot of companies, especially startups, struggle with. So why don't you go ahead and introduce our guest?
Yeah, so today we're going to be talking about attribution. And we're joined by our guest, Jamie Hallitt, who's the head of growth at Ruler Analytics. And that's a marketing attribution and measurement platform. And Jamie has been in B2B marketing for well over a decade. He's been agency side, working with some of the largest tech brands. He's been client side at PE-backed scale-ups and professional services firms. He's been freelancing, working with a bunch of SMBs. So he's seen it all. He's also a fellow Brit, but a Ruler, they are obsessed with providing marketers with meaningful insights to help make better data-informed decisions. And that's really their core purpose. And that's why we are a partner. So Jamie, welcome to Fired Up.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Great to be here.
So I want to start with something topical, and here's a data point for you, which comes from Visible, which is now part of Adobe. 34.1% of businesses don't use any attribution model to measure marketing performance. So what do you think about that?
It doesn't surprise me a great deal, to be honest. If we're looking at all businesses of all sizes, there is a fair proportion of those businesses that, frankly, are probably just slightly too small in terms of the amount of traffic that's generated to their site. Might not make sense for them to invest in an attribution tool as such. Obviously, you get attribution data from lots of different types of platforms. I guess it's up to them whether they look at the attribution data that comes with some of those platforms. But in terms of actually investing in a platform specifically for attribution, there is definitely a lot of companies out there that frankly just don't have the statistical significance in their data to warrant an attribution platform. So I mean, it's slightly higher than I'd expect. There's a couple of other reasons why they might not want to use attribution tools, but typically it's probably because of the size of the business, the amount of traffic and volume of data that's going through their digital channels. Probably doesn't make sense for them.
Right. So they're too small they can see what's working. They don't need the data. They don't need a model. They're not sophisticated enough to warrant something like that.
Yeah, it's a case of, having enough data to make decisions off. So you have to obviously have a certain amount of data to have statistical significance behind that data. So yeah, I suspect that's probably the leading challenge. I think also a lot of people just aren't aware that attribution tools as standalone platforms actually exist. Even in large businesses, we come across a lot of companies that are still using out of the box tools that have attribution or some attribution data baked into it, albeit some of it fairly simple. And that's what they feel attribution data is. They've just not been exposed to other tools. So it is a fairly new category, I should say, as well.
Okay, well, let's start with a basic question then. We're talking about attribution data. When we talk about attribution, what do we mean?
So usually we're talking about attempting to sort of quantify the success or failure of marketing. Usually, trying to put a number on it, a revenue number on a specific channel or tactic or piece of content. That's, I guess, probably the purest definition of it. Trying to analyze actually how impactful is a specific marketing channel in terms of the revenue that it generates. I think For me, it goes a little bit beyond that. Attribution is obviously a part of the measurement mix, if you like. It's more about gaining insights into how channels actually behave and how people sort of use different channels in their buyer journeys, which obviously look different for every business pretty much. So it's usually talked about as I say, about that kind of put a dollar number on a specific channel or tactic. But the bigger picture is more what insights can we gather from that data?
If I have an attribution report sitting in front of me, what are the types of things I'm going to see? You mentioned revenue. I mean, is it going to tell me, hey, you sent all these emails this month and here's how much revenue you generated? Can it get that specific?
Yes. So I guess it depends on the tools you have at your disposal, but also your own tech stack. There are some limitations to certain attribution tools depending on what you're actually using to drive traffic to your site, what you're doing outside of that, potentially offline activity. An easy way to frame it is if you have a short sales cycle, low value products, e-commerce store, not loads of channels running at the same time, pretty simple buyer journey. That is very easy to track from a digital perspective. So the data you'd expect to see that is typically what first click has someone made to actually find you for the first time. So, that could be a blog post or it could be, a speculative ad somewhere. What happens after that in an attribution report should be shown in a digital kind of footprint. So what you would see in an ideal world is all of the different touch points across that sort of buyer journey until they convert into a sale or a lead. And in some tools, you get the data around like what happens after that. So I guess the minimum you'd expect is to be able to see a click path of sorts and revenue pulled in from either a CRM system or an e-commerce platform, which then effectively attributes a certain amount of revenue to each of those touch points on that journey.
So when we're talking about channels here, we're thinking things like email, as Nicole mentioned, we're thinking Google ads, we're thinking organic search, we're thinking people calling in to the call center, any path. Is that correct?
Again, it depends on the tool. Some tools like FiredUp can do that. There are lots of other tools that offer that kind of capability. You probably won't be able to do that in something like HubSpot, for example. Not on its own anyway. You'd have to integrate lots of other tools within it. But typically an attribution platform that's designed specifically for attribution will be able to integrate with all of your different marketing sort of platforms. So it might be advertising platforms. It might be your e-commerce stores, CRM systems, email marketing tools, all of those sort of different data sources, and pull all of that data into one place so you've got a singular view of all of that activity.
One of the things that we hear from our clients a lot is that marketing attribution is really hard. Why are people finding it so hard? Is it because they're trying to do things piecemeal? They don't have like a unifying tool to give you that one-stop shop of information?
For some companies, it is really hard to get around the way that attribution has typically been framed by large tech vendors. Because I mentioned earlier, some people's view of attribution as a concept is based on whatever they've seen in whatever sort of tech stack they've already got. So a lot of them probably aren't aware that actually there are easier ways to attribute revenue if you have the tools to do so. I think that's probably part of it. The other side of it is that it is seen as a bit of a dark art these days. And there's a lot of talk around things like the death of the third-party cookie and, iOS 17 updates and all of those things that actually just paint a picture that attribution is just really difficult. For some people, it is. For some companies that have really long sales cycles, really high ACV and complex buyer circles to sell into, it is difficult. And you have to make sure that, you are considering all of the different ways in which someone might consider purchasing a product or service. And some of those things simply aren't trackable. So talking about untrackable channels, we look at things like dark social, which is a term that's sort of up and coming now. Everyone's talking about invisible touch points. For example, seeing a post on LinkedIn, screenshotting it, sending it to your boss, having a chat about it. You can't track that, but that could have a big influence on whether or not you buy something. So there are things that sit outside of sort of digital footprint, if you like, that won't appear in attribution. And I think when conversations come up around how can we accurately attribute revenue, those sorts of topics are probably coming up a bit more often nowadays. And it just becomes a bit of a blocker in terms of actually implementing any sort of attribution. So I imagine that's probably one of the main challenges.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, for companies, particularly in B2B, with a high, as you say, cost price, a long sales cycle, attribution becomes really important. Like, what is working and what's actually moving, getting customers to convert and then moving them down the funnel, and therefore, where are my investments working, or are they not? Have I got the right mix? And obviously, you need to connect a lot of different systems there, but can't I just do that in Google Analytics? Or I have most of our clients are using HubSpot. It just all plugs into HubSpot. Why can't I just get a report out of HubSpot with this?
I mean, you can get a report out of HubSpot. The challenge with HubSpot in particular is that you have a short look back window in terms of looking at previous touch points. So there's a limit to how far they will look back in a user journey. And so when you see things like first click reports in a HubSpot attribution report, you're not actually seeing the first click. In most cases, you're usually seeing the first within the look back window that they offer.
What is just for people who don't know, what is a look back window?
Yeah, so if you imagine the point of a conversion, so someone fills in a form, that is effectively the end of, I guess, the first stage of them becoming a customer. Everything that's happened prior to that is what we're trying to track. So how did they get there in the first place? Now, with HubSpot attribution, they only look back for a certain period of time. It's not very long. And the challenge with that, of course, is that your buyer journey might be 3 times that length. So the data that you're seeing in HubSpot, just as an example, just isn't accurate. So there's a lot of challenges around that. There's other things like cookies, just generally. If you're using a third-party cookie, which a lot of the tools that will plug into HubSpot will do, then they will be blocked at certain times. You have to give people the option in most countries these days to opt out of unnecessary cookies. And third-party cookies typically fall into that. So there are blockers with kind of traditional reports in more sort of traditional attribution systems. That doesn't apply to, in fact, all of the purpose-built attribution platforms that I've come across. We found ways around that.
Right. So this attribution platform, and Rural Analytics is an example, is like an extra layer in the MarTech stack that does integrate. Sure, it integrates with all the systems, but has this longer look back window. I don't know what HubSpot's is. It's 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. But obviously, if I'm a buyer, I'm doing my research, I come to the site, the project gets put on hold for a quarter because of various delays. Then I come back in. I'm going to miss all of that initial research, and I could attribute incorrectly this revenue to the wrong channel or the wrong program, and then make incorrect data decisions. And so the reason to add this extra sort of attribution layer in the stack, which is extra cost, extra complexity, etc., is to get a more complete picture of buyer behavior up to initial conversion. And then what happens after that?
I just wanted to touch on your point there around the incompleteness of the data, because the other challenge with that, of course, is that, you make purchasing decisions off the back of the data that you see as a marketer, particularly if you're using attribution data to do so. And what you'll see in systems like HubSpot is a lot of your revenue will be attributed to effectively some of the final touch points in the process. So that becomes quite dangerous, particularly when a lot of those channels typically are paid for channels. So paid search is a really good example of this. It's very common for people to convert or come into a website for the final time via a paid search ad at the end of their buyer journey. And that costs money to be able to show ads in various places. So what happens there is people see paid search, or they see any form of advertising in that platform and think, actually, this is a really effective way of generating new business. And they go out and they, invest a significant portion of their budget in that channel, thinking that this is what created the demand for my product or service. In fact, what's happening is that it's probably the one that captured it. So it's a dangerous scenario sometimes with those sort of more traditional attribution methods. So
you mentioned spending money, which probably made all of our startup marketing friends kind of perk up a little bit, because there's never enough of it at startups. So would you say that a marketing attribution tool is even more important in the startup world where literally every penny counts and you've got a board and you've got investors that you've got to answer to?
Absolutely. I think it is. In the early stages, again, it depends on their business model as well, the way that they actually sell as an organization, and of course, what their marketing strategy is. If they're investing early on heavily in brand awareness, just become famous for, existing, typically the channels that are associated with that activity are difficult to track in terms of the impact through sort of traditional, measurement methods. So, if you look at potentially using Google Analytics to measure that, it's very, very tricky to understand actually what impact did that activity have. You might see a spike in direct traffic. You might see a spike in sort of brand related organic traffic, but it's very difficult to really quantify that and assess, did this have any impact on our growth? So when you implement attribution software, you can see we ran TV ads, we ran out of home or digital out of home ads, in this period of time. And that's where you see all of the different early touch points coming through in attribution reports. And that gives startups a lot of confidence in their early stages when they're just trying to get known. Beyond that, of course, if you're looking at maybe a slightly later stage startup where they're trying to secure more funding, it becomes really important that you've got the data to build the business case for investing in certain channels. So yeah, absolutely, for startups, it's vital that they've got a way of really measuring where is my marketing growth actually going to come from.
We've talked a lot about sort of that initial lead conversion, getting people to conversion. Does an attribution model platform help after that initial conversion? How does it play a role in that?
So it's really important for sales to have a good understanding of not just how someone got to a conversion point, but what are the key pieces of content and topics that led them to get there in the first place. Having the data shared between marketing teams and sales organizations gives additional insights that they just wouldn't have otherwise. So if you look at a traditional click path in an attribution report, you'll obviously see which channels have generated clicks from a certain account or lead. And then you can also see what content they engage with. Is there a specific ad that attracted them to click in the first place? Beyond that, have they looked at pricing already? Is that something that might be totally new to them? And then from a sales perspective, you still, in some cases, have to actually qualify their level of interest. Just because someone's filled in a form doesn't necessarily mean they're ready to buy. So I think also it helps them to qualify the stage of the buyer journey that they're at, looking back at kind of click paths and understanding, is this someone who's just early on in their kind of research stage and they just want to talk to someone to know a bit more about the product or service? Or is it in fact someone who's, been researching for the last 6 months and is finally ready to talk to sales in order to buy? There's huge value that you can get from, attribution beyond just the first sort of initial hand raiser, if you like.
Yeah, absolutely. And you brought up content and specific assets, which it sounds like you can really use this data to also inform your content strategy. This is the topics that people want to read about. These are maybe the types of content that they're consuming. So is it possible, and I think this is probably a big question for a lot of our listeners who are in B2B SaaS with very, very long sales cycles. Can you use the insights from attribution reports to shorten that sales cycle?
Yeah, absolutely. So to your point around content and identifying the pieces that drive revenue, and more importantly, actually people keep coming back to throughout that process, is absolutely vital to understanding, what does my ideal content strategy look like? So a lot of the challenges that content marketers have, even digital marketers generally who look after organic SEO, you're optimizing in most cases for conversions because that's the data that you've got. You're not necessarily optimizing for revenue or ROI. And that's where attribution can really add value, because suddenly you're going from, I'm going to write this piece of content because lots of people filled in a form or made a phone call as a result of it previously, to I'm going to create this piece of content because we can see it's driven X amount of revenue. That's a much more meaningful sort of benchmark to base your content strategy on. So yeah, absolutely, it has value to that degree.
So you can see what kind of content is converting or what paid media programs are converting and optimize for that. But then you can see further down the funnel, okay, that we've got these leads and they're turned into this many opportunities, but are we really closing these opportunities? Are these the right kinds of deals? Because often I feel like marketing can see to a certain point to that marketing sales handover, and then it goes into Salesforce, and that's a different team. And even though they might get on very well, the reporting is different unless you've got a big RevOps sort of motion. And an attribution platform like this can quite easily sort of pull that information back in and add some extra transparency into actual what is working all the way down the sales process. Do I have that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. We will ingest data from all of the sources, but we'll also push data back into systems. So if you imagine a CRM system holding all of the kind of revenue data, opportunity data, we know what stage it's at in a pipeline, for example. Yes, we're extracting that data in and matching it against things like Google paid ads and tracking a full click path using that data and then using that revenue information to do the actual attribution. But we're also then pushing data back into the CRM system to say, well, it cost us this amount to generate this customer based on, the data that's potentially in Google Ads, for example. So that data flows through into the CRM system, but so does all of the data that's collected by the first party cookie. That will be the full click path, the content that you've consumed, all of that kind of great detail. And obviously any other data you collect, form stage, for example.
I'm glad you brought up the first party cookie because for what seems like forever, we have been hearing that the sky is falling, the cookieless future, data privacy, go on and on and on. And it's going to create blind spots in our data. So it sounds like Marketing Attribution Report can kind of fill in the gaps of those blind spots and maybe not quite so much the sky is falling when those third-party cookies go away.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, a lot of analytics tools still use third-party cookies, so will be blocked. So even when you're trying to measure, with the tools that feel like they're the right tools to do the job, they will still be blocked. So most attribution software actually uses first-party cookies, which is totally different. So these are cookies that are vital to the actual running of a website. If you imagine on an e-commerce site, for example, if you're trying to add a product to your basket and then later on go to a checkout system and then you complete a sale, it passes through lots of different systems potentially there. A first-party cookie is required for that to actually work and for your data to be passed from one stage of that sort of checkout service to the next. Works very much the same way as that in terms of how the cookie is placed on a site from an attribution tool. So when you see a banner pop up and it says, would you like to block cookies? You're effectively blocking third-party cookies, not first-party. And that's the key difference when it comes to attribution tools.
Right. So we talked a little bit about attribution models. You mentioned first click, there's last click, there's multi-touch, there's time decay. Can you just unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, of course. So first click, I think that the challenge that attribution vendors have had historically is the complication that's been created around attribution and all of the different models. And the fact that actually there's been very little, if not any, actual education for marketers around how does this all actually work? Is first click better than last click or not? Which one should I use? And it is confusing because, there isn't necessarily a clear-cut answer. It depends on your business model. It depends on your marketing strategy. It depends on lots of different things. So I guess I'll start with a few of those. So first click aims to measure the very first touch point and attribute revenue to that first touch point. So the idea is that you want to be able to say, this is the channel that people are finding us through, and therefore that's where the revenue should be attributed to, not the very last touch point, because there's an argument that they would have just converted somewhere else anyway. Last click kind of flips that on its head, and it's more about understanding, well, what actually led them to raise their hand and, either purchase something or get in touch with us. And that's where the revenue is attributed in the last click model. There are some other models like linear and time decay. Time decay is used typically where you've got a long process. So, for example, you might have 50 different touch points in a buyer journey. Maybe exaggerating a little, but it's definitely plausible. The idea with time decay is effectively that the more time goes on, the less the sort of early touch points are important. So the importance of those earlier touch points diminishes as time goes on. And so more of the revenue is attributed to the latter touch points in that scenario. Linear is where every single touch point gets a fair share.
Right. So each of those can show you something different. And traditionally, like, okay, you might start with one, the simplest one, maybe the first touch, like, where do people come from? Okay, we just need more people through our site, and then we'll work it out afterwards. And as the company becomes more sophisticated, it might change the model. But then you need to kind of, if you're using Google Analytics or what have you, like build up the data again because you've got a new model and it doesn't know all the other stuff. But I think one of the advantages of using an attribution platform and a reason to sort of add it into the stack is that, you can toggle between those different models because there isn't one that's necessarily best in all time. They do show you different things. So talk to us a bit about the strengths of each of those models and the advantage of having that.
Yeah, I think it's massively important that people understand how models should be used in different scenarios. So if you think about how last touch works, it's all about understanding like what led to that hand raiser. What was the thing that turned a customer or potential customer from I'm kind of interested, I'm researching, I'm doing some comparisons. What made them go, actually, I want to buy this thing, or I want to talk to sales about this. And so when you're measuring all of your marketing activity on that last bit of the funnel, if you like, you're saying that everything that came before that is not that important. That might actually be the case in a lot of scenarios for certain channels. So if you look at the different sources of traffic that go to a website and you want to see, actually, I'm aiming to, for example, use paid search to capture all the demand we're creating with all our awareness campaigns and use paid search as that final touch point. Last click is a great way of assessing whether that's been efficient or not. Have you actually achieved what you set out to do? So you need to align your attribution model with your strategy. So flipping that on its head, if you're aiming to, create sort of mass awareness and just get people to start engaging with your business in some way, and that for you is more valuable than measuring that last touch point, then first click is a great way of doing that. Time decay is a great one. For example, if you're expecting a shorter sales cycle, but for some reason your earlier marketing channels just aren't quite hitting the mark or the messaging isn't getting there and it's a long process. Time decay takes that into account. There's nuances around all of these things. But there are scenarios also where you flicking between two different things can be both confusing but also really helpful. So confusing in the sense that you've got to make sense of potentially seeing channels appearing to be really effective and then suddenly seeing them being extremely ineffective. You have to go back to, well, what is my strategy? What is the purpose of using this particular marketing channel? But also really, really effective and an efficient way of looking at marketing generally. Because, like I say, each channel is used for a different thing. And to be able to go from first touch and say, right, I'm going to measure this particular early first touch point as the most important part of our process in the early stages, having that access to first click is really important. And then on the flip side, again, if you want to look into last click and you can do that at a flick of a button, it makes everyone's life easier. I should say also, Google Analytics has made a bit of a point of moving away from traditional attribution models. So you actually don't even get first click or linear or time decay in Google Analytics 4 anymore. It's just last click or their own data-driven model, which sees us moving into, I guess, a new era of attribution where actually things like machine learning are coming into the mix and potentially slightly muddying the waters for some people who maybe don't understand how the data is being used. Google wasn't known for being particularly forthcoming with that sort of information. So it does create murkier waters for people, particularly who are new to attribution as well.
So we've talked about some of the limitations of folks' existing MarTech stacks and why they're not working and why you need that extra layer. A lot of startup marketers, they're a bit behind the curve right now. They know that their attribution has blind spots. They know there's gaps. Things are not working as well as they would want them to. Is the best way to get back on track to have a platform like Ruler Analytics? And I would imagine that some of them may be hesitant to say, oh, I need yet another tool that integrates with all of my stuff. But what's really the best way for them to get back on track and get the information that they need?
Honestly, the best thing you can do in the earlier stages is talk to your customers. Customers typically will be able to give you a clearer understanding of what actually made an impact for them in terms of like decision making. But also, you might be running 20 different marketing campaigns and tactics across lots of different channels. Talking to your customers tells you, in an ideal world, what do they actually remember? And that's the key part that we're trying to solve as marketers, is what had the impact? Well, actually, I just speak to your customers saying, what was it that made you interested in talking to us? Just asking the question alone gives you a ton more insights than we had before, which is effectively nothing. So that's a great place to start. I also think layering in marketing mix modeling, if you have the volume to do so, is an important step. But startups typically won't have the volume that's required to run machine learning models into their attribution strategy. So I definitely think that a combination of self-reported attribution, where you're asking in your forms, how did you hear about us, or what made you speak to us today, when you're on calls with them, I think that has a real sort of eye-opening moment for a lot of businesses that just don't necessarily know what's making an impact. So I'd definitely say start with customers, layer in your multi-touch attribution software data. But the other thing to note here is that attribution software tells you what happened. It doesn't necessarily tell you why it happened. And that's the insights that you get from your customers. It's, okay, this ad was effective and it achieved great results. We don't necessarily know why unless you're carrying out tons of A/B split tests at the same time and you have a clear answer there. Actually, the answer probably is best coming from the customer anyway. It might be which ad worked best and why did it work best? And the customer would be able to say, it's because I saw this picture and it stuck out in the LinkedIn feed or something. So those insights you don't get from software. And it's really important that we combine the quantitative and the qualitative data to really build a picture of not just what happened, but why it happened as well.
So talk to customers. That's good advice about learning more about what's working. What other advice would you have for startups when it comes to attribution?
The most important thing is do your research on the attribution tools. It's a fairly new category in the sense that a lot of this technology that's being used now on these tools hasn't been around a long time. And some platforms are a lot further along in their journey to building in the right kind of integrations and the right sort of platform for their customers. And they all look slightly different. So I would think early on about whether you want a tool that is plug and play, do it all yourself, build your own dashboards, or do you want something where you can stick a bit of code on your site and then, have someone on board you and build the dashboard for you. Those things are really important because it affects how you use the tool moving on, and it's a bit of a pain to change. So definitely do your research into the type of attribution tool that you want. What solution are you looking for? Is it you just want to, at all costs, find the information and be able to play around with that? Or do you want something that is easy to get up and running, doesn't require developer work, and it looks the same every time you look at it apart from the numbers? Definitely that. I think that the next step is to figure out what are you going to do with the data once you've got it. So what we don't want to be seeing is people potentially using, a week's worth of data and going, right, okay, paid search is smashing it. Let's go spend all of our money on that. We have to incrementally test the results that you're seeing in your platform. Absolutely vital that you use the data as a hypothesis to then test in real life. Those are probably the two most important things, I'd say.
Brilliant. So I want to come on to our next section, which is called Smart People, Dumb Questions. And I literally have a bag of dumb questions here. And these are sort of a bit more personal questions. So let's see what the first one is here. What's the most dangerous thing that you've ever done?
Most dangerous thing? I'm sure it's perfectly safe, but it felt like the most dangerous thing I ever did. I did a canyon swing in New Zealand a few years ago on my honeymoon. I'm scared of heights anyway, but it was the most bizarre feeling of hurtling towards the ground for a few seconds. I think that probably felt like the most dangerous thing I've ever done.
Totally agree with. I'm also scared of heights. I jumped off the highest bridge in the Pyrenees on a bungee jump, and it was just terrifying. Cured my vertigo for a few days after that, but then it came back. What's the oddest thing that you've ever eaten? So
when I was about 14, 15, I was in a school classroom in the middle of summer, and a bee flew into the room. And unfortunately, though I don't condone this behaviour, my friend decided to kill it. I was very sad. So I said to him, well, let's not waste it. And I ate the bee.
You ate the evidence.
That might be the most dangerous thing you've ever done right there, actually.
What book are you currently reading?
I'm reading The Diary of a First-Time CMO, which is a really, really interesting kind of collection of learnings over a period of time from the CMO of Cognism. And it's an absolutely brilliant book. It's got loads of snippets of just brilliant advice and knowledge. So, yeah, I recommend that.
Wonderful. So our next section is called the Fired Up 5.
Yeah, we've got a few quick fire questions for you. So first things first, what would you be doing if you were not in MarTech?
I'd probably be out busking or something. I don't think I've found a calling that's as good as fit as MarTech say.
I think that's going to make the next question more interesting, because what's the best career advice you've ever been given? Was it to go into MarTech?
Yeah, do you know what? Not far off. I think definitely to move into a role that interests you, that you know you're good at, I think is really important. It's nice to chase your hobbies, but make sure you're good at it as well. I think helps.
What's one tool that you absolutely cannot do your job without?
Gmail.
What is the coolest thing you've learned this year?
Oh, I learned the Bluey theme tune on the guitar a couple of weeks back, and it's changed my kid's life.
Nice. And finally, what hot trend have you got your eye on?
I would say at the moment it's machine learning within measurement platforms. I think I'm sort of obsessing around that at the moment.
Well, we almost got through a whole episode without talking about machine learning. So let's just unpack that quickly before we wrap. So, you talked a little bit about Google Analytics changing its attribution information to sort of go into the black box in which it might put its sort of thumb on the scale because, it's not unbiased in that sense. How is machine learning, predictive, AI impacting attribution in general?
It's difficult to tell. It's quite early days still. I suspect that we will see a little bit more transparency around how these machine learning models are being actually built, because I think customers and users of these tools will demand it. To your point about Google's own sort of machine learning tools, there's a natural bias in all of these different scenarios. There's a natural bias for attribution software to make sure that we're attributing to things we can effectively measure. There's biases everywhere. So I think transparency is absolutely key for anyone building a tool with machine learning models in it. We have to make sure that people understand what are we trying to teach this machine.
Good. So Jamie Hallitt, Head of Growth at Ruler Analytics, the attribution platform. Thanks for joining us here on Fired Up. If people want to get in touch with you, how should they go about that?
I would say just search Jamie Hallitt on LinkedIn.
And the website is?
ruleranalytics.com.
Wonderful. Listen, Jamie, great to talk to you. We look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks for your time today.
Brilliant. Yeah, thanks very much for having me.
Well, that about wraps it up for today. But before we close, we did want to offer all of our Fired Up friends a chance to grab a mega pack of all of our ebooks and guides. That's our guide to content marketing. That's our startup guide to paid media using Google Ads. It's our guide to attribution. You can get all of those, over 100 pages of goodness, at firebrand.marketing/fired up freebies. That's freebies with an S. And we hope you enjoyed the show. And if you did, please give us a rating wherever you get your podcasts, or drop us a note at firebrand.marketing. And as ever, the details of how to get in touch with our guest today can be found in the show notes. Thank you for listening. And until next week, get out there and crush your marketing goals.